Right.
Hello, everyone. I'm super excited today to be here hosting this webinar. I'm here joined with my good friend Richard Owen, and we're going to talk about CX today. And not only just CX, but talk about a proven framework that allows you to engage your organization. So, a little bit about us. My name is Vivek, and I'm one of the founders here at QuestionPro. I started QuestionPro about 10 years ago in my basement in Seattle, and we're still running the company. So, and Richard, I know he very recently sold Satmetrics to Nice Systems, so I'm very excited to have him join us. Today. A little bit about QuestionPro. Before we begin, we are a software platform that enables companies to measure all the touch points of a customer and measure and act and drive insights from it. So that's kind of our shtick, if you will. And we won't bore you too much with what QuestionPro does, but I really want to talk a little bit about Owen CX. Richard, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Thank you very much. I'm doing very well. It's nice to be here. As you mentioned, we were instrumental, I think, in the creation of NPS, 14 years ago.
That's right.
And over that time, developed a very distinct point of view on what companies did well to make it successful and where they struggle with. And so now we really want to codify that approach and help companies become successful.
So you started did you start Satmetrics, or were you part of Satmetrics when it was originally?
I wasn't the original founder, no.
Okay. But you ran Satmetrics for
14 years.
For 14 years, that's right. So Satmetrics, the people who don't know, I think I'll just kind of introduce everybody. So Satmetrics, Bain and Fred Reichel partnered together to actually invent NPS, to come up with the idea for NPS.
That's right.
You have a great story with HBR. I would love to kind of let our listeners talk about hear about it.
Originally, NPS was just a great statistical observation in some ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was a way of looking at connection between customer experience and financial performance, which was really the impediment why companies hadn't embraced a lot more CX initiatives. I think HBR, when they published the original article, the one number you need to grow, really, I think, dropped a lot of the nuance of it in order to make it a really pithy sort of story that they could push. And it turned into this one number concept. And
right.
Nobody runs their business off one number. Right. Nobody runs their CX program off one number. Right. And over-focus on the number, I think, is a mistake.
That's right.
So in some ways, I think we spent the last 12, 13 years saying it's not just the one number you need to grow.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So that's just a background. I have some housekeeping items. So we'll be taking chats and questions. We'd like to keep this session really interactive. So at the bottom of your kind of webinar platform, which we use Zoom as our webinar platform, there should be a chat window. You can click on that and you can type messages. And both Richard and I are here answering questions, and we'll just kind of keep chatting with you digitally as we go along. So jumping right into it, right? So we are definitely in a new paradigm in terms of customer relationships. We've seen, companies focus on products, then products services, then, we became customer-centric. And today, everything is about the relationship. It's not just about the customer, but the strength of the relationship you have with the customer defines almost everything that we do. We've seen companies like Amazon that have a maniacal focus on the customer and the relationship. Richard and I were just talking earlier, in terms of customer centricity, the experience and taking the friction out of the experience has been the focus of a lot of companies. And this is really, really changing how things are going. And to give you guys a brief perspective, in terms of customer experience, laggards have, cumulative shareholder growth shareholder return rather has been extremely, extremely negative. And, we don't need to, most of the people over here in this webinar know this for a fact, but again, just to kind of reinforce that. And I always like to start this off also with, like, what is customer experience? And I think I've had, and Richard, I'd like to kind of get your take on it. This is my take on it. It's like, it's a combination of emotion plus value. Now, how do you define customer experience as you think about it?
Well, I think that the reality is that customers self-define now. And what's interesting is a lot of it's to do with expectations. If you look at the sort of underlying psychology of customer experience, we are meeting or we're exceeding expectations.
Right.
And how do people form expectations?
Right.
Well, they form expectations ironically from prior experiences, something of a circular argument. In other words, the first time I got onto an airplane, I really didn't know what it'd be like.
Yeah.
Once I've traveled 1,000 times, I kind of have a defined experience.
Yeah.
And so to create a customer experience that's differential, you really have to sort of exceed people's expectations. And expectations, as we know, have changed dramatically.
Yep.
And really breakthrough companies have achieved that because they've completely realigned the expectations of people.
Right.
I mean, I know we tend to use the same examples time and time again, but these really are the companies that changed the universe. If you think about what Uber accomplished, it wasn't so much that it was a better taxi cab. It was that until you had experienced Uber, you didn't realize that what you really wanted was an ability to call up a car from your phone, to track its arrival,
right,
to pay electronically.
Yep.
You didn't know you wanted that.
Yep.
And so to create really high net promoter scores and to create a really differential customer experience, you probably have to exceed what people expect in a very dramatic fashion. And so what is customer experience? Well, in some ways, I think you're right. It's an emotional response fundamentally, but it's also connected with an understanding of rational expectations as well.
Got it. That's a great way of thinking about it. So, you've been in the business for almost 15 years. So what are the top challenges that you see?
I want to point out I was child labor when I started, by the way. We're going to talk a lot about organizational engagement. I think a lot of companies would recognize that data quality is a big problem. We're not going to go into that today, but actually having data that you can run the business on or that has credibility with the C-suite is still a big problem for a lot of companies. Inertia is a big problem, right? And inertia is a problem because unless companies have a burning platform, things are really in trouble. They don't tend to change.
Right.
We're seeing a collapse of retail right now in front of our eyes in many ways. How did it get so bad so quickly? Well, the answer is it didn't. It got bad over a decade.
10, 15 years.
But probably a little too late for people to react. Inertia tends to drive companies off the cliff. Organizational engagement, however, from a practical perspective, and for most people listening to this, is a very big problem because they can get the mechanics right, they can get the data right, they can come up with interesting insights, but they express consistently that they have trouble getting the company to do anything. And so all of this hard work doesn't mean anything if you can't get the organization engaged.
Got it. Let's dive into kind of organizational engagement. Richard, tell us what you've learned over the last 10, 15 years. What are the key drivers of engagement?
So we're gonna get into the framework in a second, but I think if you want to boil it down to three things that we're gonna try and emphasize today. The first thing is we're gonna talk a bit about incentives, and we're gonna cover this in the framework. But ultimately, incentives matter. I mean, it shouldn't surprise anyone.
Yep.
When people say incentive, what pops into their head is dollar signs or pounds or yen, depending on where you are. And I don't think you should think money. I think your instinct when you hear incentives is not money. A lot more often your instinct should be, how do I create social norms within the organization, a culture and a behavior that says that we're all incentivized to do the right thing. It's tricky, and you know it when you have it, but I think you have to get the incentives right. I think the incentives to do the right thing aren't there, or perhaps put another way, if the incentives that are laid out in the organization go against the idea of a customer experience, it's going to be a very, very hard road. The second thing I point out is don't assume that getting alignment within the organization is a one-size-fits-all strategy. If you think about the C-suite, it won't surprise anyone perhaps, wants to understand what does this do to the share price,
right?
Or what does it do to the top line of the company, or how does it improve EBITDA? And if you can't connect CX initiatives to financial outcomes, sooner or later the C-suite's going to fatigue with the whole idea of doing anything around it.
Right.
If you get to a lot of employees in the company, however, that's a completely uninteresting topic. You don't get 1,000 employees and say, look, we can add 3 cents to EBITDA next year by doing the right thing for the customer. Their motivation can be very different. And so to get them aligned and engaged in it, often it's to do with, can you establish the company's credible about it? They're going to do something about it. Are there real tangible actions taking place there? So alignment means different things for different levels. You need a multi-level alignment strategy if you're going to get that thing right. And then the third thing, and this is, you can lament this as a sign of the times, but we are all used to responding to trigger events. We're sort of stream of consciousness orientated today, whether it's your smartphone or even your email application. We don't react to things or prioritize them unless we're triggered to do so. And so because of that, what we're always trying to do to get organizations to act is we're trying to create these triggers that drive actions. And to do that, we have to have the right environment in which these triggers can work. And then we need to have the right mechanisms to get people to react. And maybe we're turning into a sort of a psychological nervous twitch of a race. But I think the reality is people are bombarded by information. Unless we can induce them to respond to our kind of information, they won't do it.
The organization cannot move without that externality.
That's what people are used to. They're used to being nudged.
Right. Got it.
So the framework. This looks like a busy slide, but it's not complicated when you break it down. We think about the sort of 4 key elements that are required to get an organization. And when you're thinking about your strategy, you want to have at least thought through and sort of filled out how you want to tackle these 4 things. So let me give you a little bit of color on each one of them. And obviously there's a bigger framework behind these, but there should be enough to give you a sense of how you can think this through. So first of all, we talked a bit about alignment here, and it's really thinking through what it is that's going to get engagement from the different levels of the organization. As I said, for the executive team, that usually comes down to an economic argument.
Right.
And for most companies, understanding the differential value between promoters and detractors is usually the key to that. In a lot of businesses, detractors have negative lifetime value. And so actually companies are better off not
even having the customer.
Yeah, don't get them in the first place. But you need at least a cursory financial model that links what your customer experience performance is to some sort of financial outcome. Because otherwise, the CFO at the very least, but I would argue very few top execs are going to sustain interest in a program unless they know why. And at some point, you're going to go to them and say, hey, we want to make a big investment. Right. And they're going to say, well, what do we get out of it? And that's not them being negative about CX. That's being rational as business people. So we talked about incentives. And the incentive story I like to tell people is always the distinction between social and economic norms. Social norms are what people do because they think it's the right thing to do.
Right. Without literally any economic interest for doing it. Right.
Right. And economic norms are things people do because they're paid to do. And we know from a lot of research that if you turn a social norm into an economic norm, you get all kinds of different behavior out of people. If you're going to pay people to treat customers right, then the equation in their head is it worth it to me to treat this customer right to earn the money? Right. Or should I just treat them badly and forgo the money?
Right.
Most companies that have sky-high NPS or really great customer experience cultures have made it a social norm, not an economic norm.
Right.
That's not to say you can't pay people, but you've got to be very careful you don't cross this invisible boundary and make this all about the money.
Right.
By the way, for those of you who run NPS programs, you recognize that people will cheat. And I think it was Denning said that where there's measurement, there's always cheating. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that you will create cheating in an extreme version if you tie people's performance too tightly to financial results.
Right. So are you recommending there will be no financial connection, or we have to be careful in terms of keeping that fairly loose? Or fairly...
I would say that at senior levels in the organization, financial connections aren't necessarily a bad thing. I think for most employees, I don't think there's anything to be gained. And quite frankly, I think most companies have trouble getting good enough quality data
to just even do your quarterly bonus based on NPS.
We used to call it the annual NPS lottery, and you got paid some or you didn't.
Right.
I don't think it's going to help. And I do think if you're going to provide financial incentives, even at the executive level, that's got to be a long-term incentive, a multi-year.
Right. It's got to be.
Plan,
yeah. Okay.
Right. I don't think you can just say, okay, next year we're going to hit this number, because that really brings me to point number 3, which is how you establish goals. And this is a bit of a minefield. Many goals are established based on, well, candidly, someone read a book and said, look, Apple has an NPS of 80. Right. We should have an NPS of 80. And we should get there in a year because our planning cycle's a year. Well, we know that Net Promoter in particular is a relative score in each industry. So Apple may be completely the wrong number to look at anyway, because unless you're competing directly with them, it's probably a moot point. Right. And even if you took some of the better scores you see or read about, the odds that you're going to get there in a year, 2 years, 3 years, maybe ever, probably the wrong way to look at it. So coming up with a better set of goals is critical. And to do that, the first thing is to calibrate goals off current performance. I mean, it sounds fairly obvious, but achieving modest movement over a 1 to 3 year period in NPS is quite a planning exercise, and quite a amount of detail goes into getting that right. And the second part of that statement was really the key piece. It takes time. And it takes time for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you change things in your business, most companies' customer experience results don't change very quickly as a consequence. It takes a while. It takes a while to fix things. You have poor customer service, you can't fix it overnight. Right? You have product deficiencies, it doesn't change overnight. These that tend to be medium to long run investments. Secondly, customers don't respond that quickly to changes. They tend to be, there's a lot of inertia in customer feelings about a brand. By the way, that cuts both ways. If you've got a great brand, they forgive you a lot of mistakes and they tend not to punish you quickly. Right. If you've got a lousy brand, they tend not to give you credit quickly.
Or even when things are going
right. So a lot of inertia in scores, which means that you're not going to get massive improvements overnight. So a big challenge to engage the organization is establishing goals that are crazy out of sight and disillusioning people when they can't make them. Much better to establish granular goals, maybe at a product line or a regional level, which are all based around that particular business unit or that product line or that geography improving themselves over a period of time.
So would you recommend, really quickly, I have a question, would you recommend then like benchmarking against yourself and saying like we need to increase our own NPS scores by 10%?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think your best benchmark is with your own performance. External benchmarking has its merits, but it's something of a different process to all of this. Most companies would far exceed their ambition if they could get their worst performing business units to their average performance.
There you go.
Well, think about that. That doesn't sound too ambitious, right? They've got the same products, the same company. Surely everyone can get up to where the average is today.
That's right.
And that would get most people over the finish line. So I don't think people should go out and start shooting for 60s, 70s, 80s. I think people should start low. And the final point I'd make around this is action, which we're gonna cover in a little bit more depth here. And that's really, how do you get the data to precipitate response within the organization immediately? How do you get people to establish process? So there's another slide. Let's move on and take a little bit more of an in-depth look around that. And we've broken it down into sort of four areas in which we want to get something going within the organization. And I'll start at the left here with the frontline organization. And most people in the Net Promoter community for sure are pretty familiar with the idea of closed loops. And they like this idea of how do we both recover detractors and potentially also mobilize promoters. And mobilizing promoters often means taking your happiest customers and getting them quickly and efficiently into your marketing programs. But recovering detractors is an exercise in getting people in your organization to respond quickly and effectively and in a well-trained fashion to immediate need to take action. And the clock's ticking. They need to be time effective, and they need to understand what the problem is, and they need to be able to be trained to be able to respond quickly. And by the way, it works. You know, the number of examples over the years of companies that have achieved meaningful improvements in performance from simply being able to respond aggressively to known deficiencies. It's quite amazing how effective a technique it is. Part of the effectiveness of it is because customers are just thrilled that you respond.
That's right. You're standing apart.
And even if you go to a detractor and you can't fix their problem, and this is one of the things that always surprised me, the fact that you attempt to actually moves their score up. So customers want to believe you're a listening organization. They want to believe you care about them. Demonstrated listening, demonstrated action, you get some credit. Now, clearly that won't solve every problem. At the end of the day, you have to fix problems. But don't underestimate the power of that. The other thing we love about frontline engagement is that it gets employees into it, right? It really does bring people into the game. I always thought it'd be such a demoralizing thing to call unhappy customers. And I found completely the opposite experience. First of all, everyone who's involved in calling up detractors usually says afterwards what a great experience it was. And how it educated them on shortcomings in the operations of the company, but also the customer perspective. And so I think it's actually a pretty uplifting process. So we like that. We think every company ought to be actively involved in engaging tactically with closing the loop in some fashion. The next one up here is really functional execution. And what we're really saying here is that every function in the organization should be working to figure out how to optimize their particular elements of the overall customer journey. So the classic example for this, and perhaps the simplest one to narrate, is thinking about a service organization. Now, it's not to suggest that service is necessarily the biggest lever in CX. It might not be. It might be a relatively hygienic part of the overall customer journey. But if you're in a service organization, your mission in some ways is to figure a way to deliver excellence at high value. You're trying to balance cost with execution. And so you're looking at data, you're looking at what you can learn from CX, and you're using it to try and figure a way to optimize your particular functional unit. And so functional execution is important because it sort of gives a bedrock for a company to improve its operations over time. Contrast that a little bit with what we think of as being strategic, which is where you're trying to optimize the overall journey. And this is a bit more problematic because now we're not saying, let's be the best at service. We're now asking, well, should we care about service? Maybe we should invest more in logistics, or maybe
a more abstract question.
How do we divide resources up amongst all the things we could do through the customer journey in order to come up with some great actions? And do those things change as we look at different customer segments? And likely answer is yes, it does. So in some instances, the investment you may want to make is in product. Maybe the investment that's going to achieve outsized returns is going to be in service. Maybe it's in logistics. Answering those questions is really a journey optimization question. Solving those problems is then a multifunctional problem. Because you simply can't do that within one function. And we know that companies have a hard time multifunctionally. So you've really got to put together some different skills and teams and have a very organized approach to solving a multifunctional problem. But the lever associated with strategic changes is bigger than functional change. Sooner or later, you've got to optimize the entire journey. At the top right is this sort of Nirvana-esque piece, which you get to where you're really disrupting. And the way to think about this is you're no longer simply trying to optimize what you do. You're trying to come up with an entirely new way of doing things. Now, this is frighteningly hard for established companies to do. And it's easy for us to sit here and say, okay, look, there's this thing called disruption. You should go and self-disrupt. It's close to a practical impossibility for a lot of companies. There's often a need to sort of create almost a separate group within the company that's going to create an entirely new mechanism for doing business. And even that's challenging. It doesn't guarantee success. What I think is important is that every organization at some point needs to keep in mind that they should at least be considering and discussing radically different ways to deliver the customer experience. One of the tricks that I've seen work very well in workshops is imagine that you were creating a brand new competitor to attack your business. And
what would you do?
What would
be the three things you would do to attack the business?
You're an insider. You know the weak spots. What would you go after? And maybe you're the next Jeff Bezos. Maybe you're the new Amazon. What would you do? And I think that what happens is by thinking through that challenge, companies often come up with strategies they can react to internally. What I found when I've done this with management teams is existing management teams actually have incredible insights on how they would disrupt their own business. Now, limitations in terms of capital and bandwidth often get in the way of doing anything about it. But I've never met a management team that doesn't know what they would do, and doesn't find it quite an interesting exercise to imagine doing that. So these four different mechanisms, when you're planning out your actions, put in place processes behind all four. Clearly, the frontline execution tends to be a lot more systematized. You're dealing with a higher level of volume, a lot more sort of tactical execution, but you need the environments and the processes behind the other three,
right,
if you're going to get the organization to take action.
Right. And we'll talk a little bit about the functional side in terms of what we can do from QuestionPro. But tell us a little bit about kind of what's right and what's wrong in terms of CX.
Yeah, so let me perhaps close out a little bit here by talking about some of the do's and don'ts. And it's really a recap of what we just said. I think you want to recognize behavior. I think most CX programs need to be fundamentally positive.
Mm-hmm.
We're not here to beat people up for poor performance. We're really here to recognize the right behavior in the organization and reward it.
Yep.
We want to be very careful about linking financial data, especially to poorly thought through targets. We do want to trigger actions. When we see changes in data, we want to do that. We want that to be organized.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to sort of assume it'll happen. We want to be tracking it. We want to find ways to create sort of economic linkage to get the executives involved. And we've got to look at these multiple levels in the organization as different audiences that we want to get aligned with our program. As I said, in terms of goals, I think look at a multi-year approach to goals. Look at what you're going to accomplish in year 1 versus year 2 and 3. It's going to be very different types of goal. And I think don't worry too much about absolute NPS performance for the company. Worry a lot about relative importance, relative improvement, I should say. How are we going to do better next year than we did this year? As opposed to how we're going to be the number one in our industry.
Right. I absolutely love what you suggested in terms of it's a very easy thing to get behind. It's like, hey, the lowest performing guys should at least strive to achieve to the average, right? So that's something that I think anybody in any organization can get behind in terms of benchmarks and goals, and you can probably sell the entire company on that. So that being said, I think, Richard, you talked a little bit about functional, and I want to jump in over here and talk a little bit about, one of the newer features within QuestionPro CX that we are launching. We've talked about closed loop in terms of making sure the customers are taken care of, but also in this particular kind of mechanism, what we aim to do is to make sure that the organizationally, we have the process and systems in play to understand where the gaps are in terms of CX. So this comes from a little bit of kind of research that we've done, as well as kind of practical considerations that we've had with our existing customers, where just measuring something like we've talked about, measuring something doesn't necessarily fix it, and measuring something and going back to the customer also doesn't fix it. What it does is makes the customer definitely happier than what he was 10 minutes ago before you called. But if there is a billing problem, or if there is a double billing problem, or if there's one issue that is bothering us, unless that is fixed, it's not fixed. And a lot of it is about removing the friction within the experience is what we are aiming at. So how can we, from a technology and process perspective, how can we help? So we've created this concept of smart loops, which we wanted to showcase a little bit to you. As with every kind of looping system, when things go south, it goes into a workflow. And we have our kind of closed loop system within QuestionPro, where somebody gives a bad score, it goes into the right space. As long as the organizational hierarchy is set up correctly, the right guys get notified on their smartphones, text messages, email alerts, however it goes. But what we've also enabled over here, if you think about it, there's a smart loop tab over here, and what we enable the frontline guys to do is to take the issue and actually document the issue within the department and team within the organization. So in this particular case, this particular issue it's a finance and a billing issue. So we are tracking that information internally. We obviously track this from a customer perspective, but now we have some intelligence about, look, how many issues does finance and billing have? Finance is the organizational unit, billing is obviously a subunit within finance, right? So what we are doing is tracking that, and then we've also gamified that a little bit, where we say, like, look, this issue has already been reported, and all I do a +1 on the issue that has already been reported. So you can have multiple customers facing the same issue, and the CSR, or in this particular case, either the people who are in the front lines have the capacity to go into the system and not only take care of it from a ticketing perspective from the customer's viewpoint, but also create some data for the organization that can be harvested and mined. And so as you can see over here, there is a +1 concept of checking things out. And what that does at the end of the day is, at a holistic level within the organization, you can look at by department internally and say, like, where is the friction within the organization, right? And who can really fix the friction? So in this particular case, like, customer support's, having some friction, finance, IT, marketing, product, etc. So you have a pretty good visibility into each of those functional units that are available, and then you can drill down obviously into them and to say, like, what are the issues that have been coming up, and we can create, these are all dynamic, these are not predefined, this is defined on a per customer basis, obviously. And so for a given time period, we allow you to take a look at all the issues and who are responsible for really fixing those issues. Ultimately, if it's a double billing issue, the CX program can't fix a double billing issue. It's really e-commerce and or the finance team that has to fix the double billing issue. And unless that is fixed, you're continuing to gonna have kind of friction with the customers. So we're calling this thing Smart Loop, and this is being introduced into our platform towards the end of this month, and the beginning of next month, early December, this will get launched. And we believe that this goes to kind of step number 2 of what Richard talked about in terms of organizationally engaging, functionally organizationally engaging within the company. And lastly, I just want to kind of go over some of the functionality in terms of this gets attached to this does get attached to kind of what we are thinking about in terms of driver analysis and priority matrix. So using data, we can even kind of using the platform, we can even tell you, like, what are the issues that are actually driving NPS effectively. So effectively, the system does a regression analysis around it and say, like, these are the issues that are actually driving your scores lower, in terms of what are the in terms of not just these are the main issues that have been connected, but we can correlate that to obviously the NPS score, which we have from the customer, and that also gives you a kind of driver analysis by department and by teams. So that's an important element to this. So that's about it from QuestionPro, and we want to take some questions from you right now, and we'll be answering questions as we go along. Thank you, Richard. It was great having you here. Thank you again.
Always a pleasure.
All
Thanks
right.
very much.
Thank you.